on YouTube again. All right, cool. I'm going to get started here. So, talking about the gut microbiome today. Obviously, this is a topic that it gets a lot of attention, and the gut is sort of like the gut microbiome is, and like, foods that are touted to improve gut health are like a really hot topic right now, and something that people sort of really, I think, are going all in on and promoting really hard. So I think it's important for us to understand, what the evidence actually says about it, which I think, as we'll discuss more over the course of this talk, is that really we don't know as much as people seem to propose that we think they know about it. A lot of it's unknown. The research isn't super strong about a lot of the things that are recommended. So it's just important to understand some of these things before we go about having conversations with clients about them. So I guess getting started, when we talk about the gut microbiome or gut health, this was the first question they asked in the podcast, what is gut health? And I guess also, what is the gut microbiome?
Gut health is undefined, from what I understand. It's an undefined term, gut health. There's really no definition of like gut health. Like it's hard to define, I guess. It's like, I think the way it's portrayed in, I guess the marketplace is, these foods will improve your gut health, or avoiding these certain activities or foods will improve your gut health. Well, what does that actually mean? Like, am I going to poop less, or am I going to have a better immune system? Or so to me, it seems like it's not super well defined, and doesn't seem like there was a very clear definition on gut health.
Yeah, she definitely covered that. I guess what I get from it overall, like what they're talking about is, the type of bacteria or like type of like microorganisms that you have in your gut. And, she goes into there's good and there's bad. And, you would like to have a balance of a lot more good bacteria, which I guess, leads to, better physical and mental health if you have what is considered good gut bacteria. So that's kind of the best I can do to define it.
I think gut health has a lot to do. In the context of this podcast, they certainly talked about the microbiome and things largely in the small and large intestine, but gut health also extends clearly through to the small intestine, the ability to absorb nutrients properly, and then getting into the large intestine, the ability to expel waste products properly. I took it to mean on a lot of levels the lack of dysbiosis in the gut as much as anything else. It's almost gut health, as best as we can define it right now, seems like it is the absence of known pathology in the gut, more so than it necessarily is any state of optimal functioning.
Yeah, that's what she ended up sort of falling back on at the end, after saying that we don't really have a clear definition. Is the best we can do is the absence of dysfunction, which is sort of not it's not the best definition in the world, but it's the best we have right now. People will, like, when they market probiotics, that gut health is sort of purported to improve your immune system and your metabolism and your energy levels and all this, that, and the other thing. But we really don't necessarily know what proportion of certain what proportion of microbes and different types is really ideal, and that might be different. They mentioned it's different from, even in the absence of dysfunction, if you look at like gut diversity and what species are present in different people's guts, especially regionally, it's very different. So there might not even be one universal, good gut microbiome. That's probably individual to like your environment, what you're eating and where you live, that sort of thing. All right. So, we've sort of loosely defined what is gut health. Yeah, well, we didn't really define what the gut microbiome is. So I guess on a high level, what is the gut microbiome?
I guess the best way to put it would be it's just like this living culture of bacteria that exists within small intestine, gut. And I don't really know how to best explain all the different processes that it's responsible for, but I know that when you have an imbalance of certain bacteria, and I think she mentioned briefly later in the podcast, like different strains of bacteria, probiotics can help balance out the gut and the different bacteria in it. So yeah, it's like a living culture of microorganisms that are responsible for a host of different processes in the body.
Yep. Yeah, essentially just all these living, breathing microorganisms that populate our, largely the large intestine, the colon, that have been identified in, potentially impacting things like being tied to insulin resistance and obesity, and perhaps your cognition and mood. I mean, I feel like it's tied to almost everything. I feel like has been tied to the gut microbiome, whether there's a ton of research on it or not. But yeah, anything to add there?
Well, it's clearly really complicated, and that's why we don't understand many of the answers. If you think about it, practically speaking, the large intestine is designed for one function and really one function only. That's to eliminate waste from the body. Once you're into the large intestine, that's one way, do not enter. That's going out. And I think the interesting thing is how many upstream things are impacted by a part of the body which is largely involved in waste product elimination. And I don't think based on not just this podcast, but other things I've read previously, they don't really have a good understanding of why some of that occurs, even though they do see the upstream manifestation of it.
Yeah. I think our understanding of the gut is very, very early right now. I think, hopefully we'll know a whole lot more in 5, 10, 15 years.
I look at our understanding of the gut, where it is right now, with where our understanding was of the brain in 1990. At that point, we knew that neuroplasticity existed. We understood some substructures and neurotransmitters in the brain, but really within the past 30 years, where all of this emerging evidence has made its way into academia and research labs on the brain, I feel like the gut microbiome is in that very same early stage of the cycle right now.
Yeah. All right. So I guess let's really quickly, just for the sake of the rest of the conversation, outline so you hear about prebiotics and probiotics quite a bit when we're talking about the gut microbiome. So it's important to define those, as well as a third one that I actually hadn't heard about until listening to this podcast, which was postbiotics. So what are prebiotics? What are probiotics and postbiotics?
Prebiotics are just food for the microbes. So you get those from fruits, veggies, and legumes. There's either beans, black beans, and pinto beans. Probiotics are the actual microbes that live in the gut, and those probably need to be had in supplement form, which needs to be certified, because you don't know what the hell you're getting in most supplements, and in most foods you can't really know how efficacious it's going to be, because you don't know what the actual CFU content is. And then the postbiotics, I'm in the same boat as you, Sawyer. I never heard of that before. From what I understood, it's products produced by the bacteria in your gut that's beneficial for the host, so just beneficial for us. So the bacteria produces X substance that helps us in some way. So those are the basic definitions of the three.
I understood that last one, and I never heard of it either, to be essentially metabolites of the bacteria that are in the gut that feed back onto those same bacteria and microorganisms that they use as nutrition to bolster their function.
Yeah, exactly. And you can get pre or probiotic supplements, but prebiotics you can get from your diet largely, and they made probably a little bit, at least from what I took from this podcast, a little less important than a probiotic supplement, which are actually, you know, the microbes themselves. And then you can get those either live. Traditionally, you get those live, but I guess they are learning that you can, there can be a benefit to even ingesting like dead, unactive versions of the probiotics.
Do any of you guys take prebiotics or probiotics?
I don't.
I have never done it regularly, no.
Have you done it at some point though?
Once or twice I have at a doctor's recommendation while taking antibiotics, which is a conversation we'll have. Never regularly.
In my green supplement, there's a prebiotic blend to it. But I read somewhere, probiotics, it depends on what strains you are lacking in that dictates effective probiotic supplement. So, and again, I'm not sure how you would find that out. Like, you know, you're lacking in this strain, so you should take this specific probiotic. I was under the impression that it's not effective to just take a generic probiotic supplement that isn't specific to the strain that one is lacking in.
Well, they talked about specific strains being beneficial for specific things, but not like so they talked about this like S. boulardii or something like that is beneficial for reducing like traveler's diarrhea, and then this other one is useful for helping pediatric diarrhea, but not adult diarrhea. That's sort of another one that's helpful with IBS or IBD. So I think it's like very just taking like a general probiotic. Yeah, I may not necessarily be as beneficial versus like having like a targeted, this is for this type thing. And they didn't really touch on this in this podcast, but I've heard in other podcasts similar to what you mentioned, Kemp, about almost in some ways, if you take a probiotic, or maybe this is a little bit more prebiotics actually, I'm not sure, but there's such thing as like a bacterial overgrowth too, where you can actually have a negative impact by feeding, like if you already have let's say theoretically you have an imbalance where you have more of, you know, you're one strain than another strain and it's a little out of whack, and then you feed that strain even more where the probiotic you take has more of that, then it could make things worse. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of one of those things where we have like a little bit of knowledge and we're trying to like do things based on a little bit of knowledge, and that can be dangerous sometimes. That quote, whatever it is, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
You should definitely figure out what the prebiotic is that helps you address pediatric diarrhea. That seems like that would be incredibly relevant in your world right now.
One of the lactobacillus strains, they said. I don't remember the exact one. But yeah. But yeah, I mean, super interesting stuff because it seems like most people, if you ask, you know, most people would say, you know, yeah, probiotic supplement, that's great. You know, everyone should be on one of those, but we really don't know as much as we seem to think we do when making those recommendations.
Well, it's interesting because normally my stance on supplements is if it's not going to hurt you and it might help you and you're willing to spend the money, go ahead and take it. But it seems as if in the case of prebiotics and probiotics, that it actually could be harmful in some cases. One of the things I thought was interesting, I know we'll get to it later, is talking about the antibiotic involved changes to the gut microbiome, and in some cases in more robust antibiotics almost completely wiping out the microbiome. And the thought that in that case, I believe it was taking the probiotics actually made the repopulation of the gut microbiome worse than if you just did nothing at all, which I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, what did they say? Reestablish a gut microbiome after like antibiotics. They said like the fastest way to do it was like a fecal transplant, which is, I guess that's dangerous if you don't do it the right way. So they're not really researching that right now because there's actually been like someone died from doing that the wrong way. Anyways, but the next best thing was just to do nothing. And normally like your gut microbiome goes back after, they mentioned like a couple weeks. Then they said the probiotic supplement actually could cause dysbiosis by like basically that individual's native biome is being outcompeted by the supplement species that you may not actually need, or might not be ideal for your specific pre-existing biome. Super interesting.
Like when you were on roids, Mike.
We got to put that on the recorded podcast.
Oh, this is recorded. Sorry. I just swore.
We're not like we're live. This is going on AFS TV or anything. Anything else you want to tell people about, Kev?
Are we live right now?
No, we're not live.
Keep going.
I love you fucks. Oh shit, I said that.
All right, reining it back in. Antibiotic. The antibiotic question was on there further down, but we're already sort of having it now. So I mean, yeah, that is a general recommendation people make is to have a probiotic with antibiotics, but that may not necessarily be the wisest thing to do based on the information shared in this article. Just again, we don't know. It's very individual. It seems like it's a very individualized thing.
I think a couple things that struck me as interesting on the antibiotic discussion. First and foremost, I think there's a lot of people that are very uninformed about what antibiotics can do to gut health. And then on the flip side, I also think there's a lot of people that are very inadequately overinformed about the deleterious effects of antibiotic on their gut, and then they choose to not take antibiotics because of what it can do to the gut. And neither position I feel is good. And people need to understand that you can't chronically be on antibiotics, but people also need to understand that based on exactly what the woman said in the podcast, your microbiome is going to repopulate itself in a couple of weeks, provided you go back to a relatively normal balanced diet. That I've actually heard of people not wanting to take antibiotics because they didn't want to disrupt their gut microbiome. And that's not at all what any of the research suggests whatsoever. Obviously, those antibiotics play a much critical, larger role in preventing disease and infection.
Yeah, the benefit of antibiotics and responsible use recommended by a doctor is probably going to exceed the potential very short-term detrimental effect on your gut microbiome that's just going to bounce back within a few weeks.
And she said that one of the least invasive antibiotics was zithromycin, Z-Pax, and that seems to be the one that's most commonly prescribed. Whenever I hear an antibiotic being prescribed, it tends to be zithromycin.
Yeah. And they mentioned there are some situations where you actually wouldn't want your gut microbiome to necessarily go back to its previous profile, like if they are prescribing it for like a very, like something related to GI health, like really bad case of diarrhea or something like that, that actually is a good thing. So it's interesting as well. All right. So let's start talking about some of the other possible strategies, foods, etc., lifestyle things that can improve the gut microbiome. What were a couple of the strategies, foods, etc., that people that have that are highly recommended in the popular media to improve gut microbiome? And then what did the podcast explain the research says on these things? Let's start with fiber. What do we know about fiber?
In the case of fiber, I think the media proposes like the gut health heal all ailments, whereas it looks like fiber is good. The absence of fiber seems to be the thing that would be not good for your gut health. But having adequate fiber seems to have like a better, foster a better environment in the microbiome versus the absence of fiber. So I think just the recommended daily, depends on the person, what is it, 30 grams of 30 grams of fiber a day for the average person. Any more than that doesn't seem to have much more benefit to the gut. So I thought that was interesting. It's contraindicated in the media.
It sounded like she was saying that when we take in a lot of fiber, like the bacteria that's in our gut, that's something that they feed off of. And I guess it's, fiber's good for the bacteria in our gut. I guess she was saying like they thrive off off of that, I guess.
Yeah, remember, fiber is not digestible. It isn't pulled out in the small intestine. And essentially, it's whatever is not pulled out in the small intestine that's a fuel source can be used in the large intestine.
Yeah, essentially, fiber is essentially a prebiotic, something that the bacteria are going to feed on.
Did anybody pick up on the fact that the Hadza Indians eat 150 grams of fiber per day? Did anybody that?
I didn't pick up on that, but wow.
She was just talking about how different cultures have different fiber intakes. And she said the recommended, I can't remember what the average fiber intake is for Americans. They're not hitting the 20 to 30 grams a day, but she contrasted that with the Hadza Indians, they're a hunter-gatherer tribe of Indians, and they could be upwards of 150 grams of fiber per day.
There's a special
Jared should do an experiment, see what happens if you eat 150 grams of fiber in a day.
You think that Caden gets angry when he has to poop?
Yeah, he's on a zero fiber diet right now.
What'd you say, Jared?
There's a YouTube video. You guys know that? I can't remember his name. He's a chef. He's Asian. He travels the world and does like crazy shit. And he lived with the Hadza people for like 3 months. It's fucking insane. He took like power bars with him, and he could only survive off them for so long. And then he had to go on like hunting trips with them and stalk animals and gather food. It's crazy. Just look up comedian or chef. He's both. Travels with Hadza Indians. It's nuts.
It's not the guy that does the Ugly Delicious show on Netflix, is it?
It might be
that one. Maybe.
Yeah, it might be him.
Might be him. I have to look it up.
I saw him. He told the story on the Rogan podcast, and he was talking about how there was one Hadza guy that was like the stoner of the Hadza group, and he just smoked weed and like trailed behind everybody all the time. It was really funny. Like they have those people in those tribes as well.
Well, the Hadza, not to get off topic, but the Hadza are actually really interesting to study because they're one of the few large group of hunter-gatherers that the Hadza have been studied for physical activity research before because they're a hunter-gatherer tribe. I've heard of Hadza studies done quite a bit.
Yeah. I thought the analogy or metaphor she used on fiber was really good about being up in like a plane and looking down on a forest, and you can tell that the trees are different, but you really don't know what trees they are, and then you don't know what's underneath the trees. And we know that when you ingest fiber, it seems to help, but we don't know how or why it helps. And what that means for like causative changes in the body for other issues or benefits and things of that nature. So there's a bunch of, we know that it's generally probably helpful. We don't really know how or why. Was pretty interesting to me, but I really like that tree analogy that she used.
Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah, we see something on the surface level is changing, but we can't see any deeper of what's actually happening. Yeah, below that very first layer. Yeah. What from what we do know, and this is sort of impactful for a number of the things that we're going to talk about as potentially helping, is that it does seem like that the gut microbiome is, 60 to 80% of it doesn't really change over the course of our lives, sort of as the number she mentioned. So, anything that, even regardless of your diet or your physical activity, et cetera, 60 to 80% of that gut microbiome is going to be the same no matter what. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously that remaining 20 to 40% could certainly end up having relevant impacts on our health and well-being.
I feel like that range is normal for any aspect of physiology. 60 to 80% is not going to change. It's the 20 to 40% that lifestyle interventions can make a difference on. And if it's on the high end of that, 40% is a pretty dramatic intervention, but there's a limited homeostatic range that things have to stay in order for us to be alive.
Yeah. Let's talk about meat. Oh, sorry, what, Mike, were you gonna say something?
I was just saying, except for Kemper's gut, I don't know what's going on there.
More fiber.
I didn't mention meat on the reflective questions, but since I think most of us on this call enjoy our protein, let's talk a little bit about meat. There's been, some beliefs out there that, eating a lot of meat could have a negative impact on your gut microbiome. What does the research that she stated say about that?
I remember her saying something about red meat. Um, like red meat like lowers like the number of microbes in your gut or something like that.
I didn't take a note on that. I may have missed it. I don't recall that part precisely.
That was when she was talking about some vegans that eat some red meat.
Gotcha.
Yeah, well, I remember that part as well. And I first off, I couldn't quite understand the vegans that were eating red meat. Secondly, I wondered because of that, if they're primarily vegan and they eat red meat, does that somehow perturb the gut microbiome to cause issues? From what I remember her saying, and from what I've heard otherwise, that most things in moderation aren't going to cause a very significant impact on the gut microbiome one way or the other. I assume if you were consuming, I don't know, 5 pounds of 75/25 ground beef every day, that probably would have a negative impact on the gut microbiome. But in the physiological amounts that we have, the impact is pretty minimal.
It sounds like a lot of the research, is sort of studying extremes. Like they mentioned, a study that compared vegans, so no meat, to people. They put them on a meat and cheese only diet. So like that had a negative impact on your gut health, their gut microbiome diversity. Eating only meat probably not a good idea in many ways. But the inclusion of meat within the context of a normal diet is not going to, from what we know, is not going to have a negative impact on the gut microbiome. But if you take it to an extreme, it can.
And this is where I just wonder how these narratives get created around certain foods or nutrients that are demonized. Because clearly something we've been eating for centuries that is a consumable food product that gives us viable nutrition in moderate amounts. How could any of these things, I don't care if it's a simple sugar or a protein source or meat source, how could they be bad in moderate quantities? It just evolutionarily doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's always it makes me laugh. It's like that. The how going from a study that where somebody like literally had people eat only meat and cheese for 4, 6, whatever number of weeks, and now meat is bad for your gut health is just an absolute statement. It's just kind of crazy.
And she brings up the studies with mice or rats too. Like you're already like comparing like a mouse to a human or something like that. But then they talk about like the amount that they give would be like, a human would never have that amount, compared to their body size. So I wonder when they have experiments like that, like I guess kind of like what the point is, because I don't feel you can really like apply that from what you get from those studies.
It's important to use the rodent models to develop a framework, but all you can do is say you have a framework when you've done a study with a rodent model. Then eventually you have to take it into human trials. They mentioned the first talk of the microbiome I ever remember hearing about was back in college when they talked about the fecal transplant from the obese mouse to the lean mouse and vice versa. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. If we could do a fecal transplant and address obesity, that would be earth shattering. But turns out that based on what she said here, and I hadn't actually heard any follow-up on the research, probably because it didn't produce a result, but that doesn't transfer over into the human species, which is not uncommon. But you can do a lot of shit to rodents you can't do to humans.
I think rodent studies, they can be very helpful if you look at them with a very, from a perspective, in sort of neutral perspective without biases. But when we hear, something that happened in a rodent study that then sort of appeals to maybe some of our pre-existing biases, or we're not necessarily don't understand how to interpret it, then it turns into the narratives get all crazy. But on that note, I guess we could start talking a little bit about artificial sweeteners. This is somewhat relevant. I know there were some rat studies done on certain looking at the impact of artificial sweeteners on gut health, which is something, well, at least in my experience, when I have conversations with clients about artificial sweeteners, or switching from sugar sweetened beverages to artificial sweetened beverages, a lot of people, you hear, oh, those are even worse for you, so why should I even switch to them? And a lot of that, I think, is centered around, not all of it, but there's claims about all sorts of things, but just within the context of this conversation about artificial sweeteners, do they have a negative impact on your gut health? That seems to be accepted by the popular media. Most people out there is like, oh yeah, they do. They're bad for your gut. Is, based on what we know, is that statement accurate? What do we know about that?
She made it sound like they don't affect the gut health as much as what people claim. And she did bring up that one rat study. There were 2 artificial sweeteners that started with an S. But there was some research that was done where this was the one where they did with the rodent, and was an amount that a human would never have. And there were changes, but overall, she made it sound like there isn't as much of an effect on gut health as what is claimed.
Saccharin and sucralose were the 2 best ones that. Those were the ones that in rat studies did show to actually that you could create insulin resistance with very, very high levels of those. But those are not levels we could ever reach. But it seems like with those 2 artificial sweeteners, they do seem to interact with the gut in some ways, but it's very, very minimally. And they only actually saw it when people were consuming about the equivalent of 13 to 17 cans of diet soda per day. So something you could do, but very, very few people would. Most diet soda drinkers are probably having, 1, 2, 3 a day or something like that.
I once heard that John Daly used to drink like 20 after he stopped drinking alcohol. The golfer John Daly, after he stopped drinking alcohol, he would drink like 30 Diet Cokes a day.
You can, yeah. I mean, there are people that you hear, I'll drink an entire 2-liter of diet soda in a day or something like that. But even at that level, it was fairly minimal. And we know that it interacts with the gut, but they didn't really say anything about that interaction having like a clinically significant effect, which is that sort of the same conversation about that like you're looking at the top of the forest, you don't really know what's happening beneath it. Just because something changes doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good or bad.
I was trying to tell this to Coco Newton years ago, Jared. What is interesting is that she did say that more research is needed on sucralose, Splenda, because it's very molecularly similar to sucrose, to table sugar. And I would be curious about that, because of all the artificial sweeteners that exist, Splenda is by far the most widely used, and it has the best taste, but that's because it's so molecularly similar to sucrose. I'd be curious to see as that research continues to emerge.
Yeah, that would be interesting. They did mention aspartame that does have a little bit of research and doesn't really seem to interact with the gut the same way that saccharin or sucralose does. At the end of the day, I mean, we can't, the absence of good data showing negative impacts doesn't mean that there's not the possibility that there could be. So we shouldn't necessarily say, oh yeah, this is fine for you. But you just have to, like most things, if you have it in a reasonable amount, it's probably not going to hurt you. And if you're weighing the pros and cons of, a hypercaloric diet because you're drinking 1,000 calories and sugar sweetened beverages a day versus, which we know there's health implications to that, as opposed to the trade-off of the diet sodas, that there may be this small impact. It seems like a fairly, no-brainer in my eyes. Anything else on the artificial sweeteners conversation? What about fermentable foods? These are another really, really big one. Kombucha, kimchi. All these things that people are really, really passionate about and marketing heavily as being superfoods, if you will. What do we actually know about those based on the research?
As far as the effect on the gut microbiome, they really don't know. They did say that fermented foods tend to be more digestible because your gut doesn't have to do it. So you tend to have less issues with the same food that's not fermented already. So, but they don't really know the amount of bacteria, living bacteria, CFUs that are in it. So, like everything that they presented, might be good. Not really sure if it is. They don't know how or why. They don't know what it affects and what the effects of that are systemically. So,
I know the feeling, like you might feel a little bit better with maybe less bloating or less gas, which could be beneficial, but I think it's a lot of perception, you know.
That's a whole separate conversation too. I think, people tend to sort of like create a gas and bloating is a bad thing when it's, sort of just a natural, in some ways it could be a good thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, separate conversation.
it's only a bad thing socially
Yeah.
and in relationships.
Depends on who you hang out with.
If
Keep
you ever
trying to
look
tell
at that
Caden.
stack, it's a bad thing.
Well, it doesn't bother me. I do think that the fermentable foods does fall into the category of something that's not going to hurt you. It might help you. Therefore, if it's something like kefir or kefir, however you pronounce that, if you want to have that, then I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily, but probably better than a lot of the other alternatives of things you can consume.
For sure. Yeah, I think if so long as you're our whole goal here is just making sure that when we're communicating with clients, we're not making claims that are unsubstantiated by research. We can't say with any degree of certainty that kombucha or kimchi are going to have a positive impact on your gut microbiome, but they're not going to hurt you, and they're much more nutrient rich than a lot of the foods we put in our bodies anyway. So probably not necessarily not a bad thing. Although I have heard there was that story a couple of years ago about the guy who was making his own homemade kombucha and ended up either dying or getting really sick from it. So don't do that. Buy it. Don't make your own.
Don't do your own fecal transplants. Don't make your own kombucha. Kombucha, that shit's expensive though. That is one of those categories of things where you may want to consider if it's actually worth the money on a per serving basis.
Yeah, for sure. There's the marketing campaign behind that stuff is pretty crazy.
Yeah, Moose would bring one of those in. He'd be drinking one of those before he would lift, more times than not. Claire gets a lot of kombucha too. I don't know. I've tried to drink it. That shit is. I don't know how you explain it. It's a lot of flavor. Hard to get down.
I like kimchi. I love kimchi. So that would be my go-to fermentable food if I was going to eat something on a regular basis.
Does it cause Claire to be gassy, Tyler? Does it result in those issues?
It certainly can. Yeah.
All sorts of interesting YouTube conversations for when this goes up.
I love it.
Sorry, Claire. All right. What have we not talked about? They mentioned how the impact of stress and sort of some lifestyle, sleep, mindfulness practice. What did they mention about the impact of all of those things on gut health?
That seemed to be the one where it seemed as if there was the most positive research, particularly from a stress management perspective, on its role in gut health. I don't think she got into any mechanisms, but she definitely intimated from what she was saying that it does make quite a difference on just overall gut health and IBS and things like that.
So you just shared stress and Jared, you want to?
Yeah, there's a really good article that I scanned a little bit ago on stress-related disorders in the microbiome and IBS and things of that nature. And there was some research done with cognitive behavioral therapy and other stress reduction therapies that reduce irritable bowel syndrome as much, if not more, than a lot of medications did. And I know personally, if I'm really nervous or stressed about something, my GI, that's the only time my GI system isn't right. Otherwise, I can pretty much eat anything except for spicy chicken pad thai, and I'm good.
Or shellfish.
Yeah, shellfish is just anaphylactic death, so I try to avoid that as much as possible. My GI won't matter at that point. But yeah, so that was something that was pretty interesting. They also talked about elevated cortisol levels, and I think the effect on the lining of the intestines and inflammation associated with it possibly. So it does look like stress disorders are possible, have a possible negative impact on the GI system and microbiome. And I think that's probably like a two-way relationship. I think stress can impact the GI system, but then also the GI system can further agitate the mental health of somebody, which is kind of a compounding effect. I think that there's obviously a back and forth there, that if you have issues with the gut, it can create stress, which can further the issues with the gut. So there's a lot there. Obviously, I sent you guys an article. We can post it in the YouTube chat if people want to check it out, but it's one of the more complete reviews that I've read on it.
I certainly remember back in my high school sports days, the mornings of football, football games and whatnot, I would, have GI issues pretty much every single time. Just imagine living your whole life with that sort of, that level of chronic stress.
Mm-hmm.
I could see it.
Well, and if you think about it in terms of the mechanisms in the stress response, what's happening? You're elevating your epinephrine, your norepinephrine. Those are things that favor the shunting of blood away from the GI tract, impairing digestion and absorption during a time where you otherwise wouldn't want to do it. Cortisol, also part of the stress response, like Jared said, that impacts the endothelial lining inside of all of the smooth muscle in the body, not just the GI tract. So I think it makes sense mechanistically why it would have an impact.
Sure. Scanning my notes here, see if there's anything we missed. Were there anything off that you guys can think of that was mentioned in the article that we haven't talked about yet that was important? I think that's most of it.
Other than the relatively undramatic conclusion we're going to come to about what you should do to improve your gut health.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we can just jump there, which is the question, take home messages, which not going to be super sexy, but what are our take home messages? If you are, what are our take home messages here for people looking to improve their gut health, their gut microbiome?
Well, actually, we did talk about the fecal transplant, and we shouldn't gloss past that because they did talk about two ways that you can do it. They talked about taking a fecal sample from a healthy individual, and I'm sure it's more complex than this, but essentially distilling it or concentrating it down into a capsule and then consuming it, which seems like it was the most efficacious way. And the other option was an enema. And the concern with that, or in terms of how efficacious it would be, is if it could make it way far enough up into the GI tract, particularly into the small intestine, to be effective. But as you suggested earlier, sir, there's been a couple of more severe side effects from fecal transplants at this point. And at one point, that was believed to be something that could be used to treat a whole host of issues, from mental health problems to obesity to insulin resistance, but seems like that it may be more complex in terms of the side effects than what was first thought.
Yeah, from the notes that I took from the podcast, it sounded like she had, based on the research, that there's a halt on the research in that field for the reasons you stated, Mike. But prior to that, we've seen it's been helpful in mice, as we've already stated, with regards to obesity, but not necessarily humans. That hasn't been able to be replicated in humans yet. It sounds like the research that has been done has not found an impact on mood disorders. That doesn't mean that it can't. It just hasn't been found yet. However, they said they have seen an impact with C. diff, which she mentioned, that C. diff is basically it's a bacterial issue that can have serious chronic bad diarrhea and other, like they had like life, like basically inflammation of the colon. So you can die from this. So it is, in that way, it does seem promising.
Very commonly hospital transmitted infection. That's where C. diff tends to manifest itself more often.
But more research needed there, it sounds like. All right. So with that said, if you're talking to a client who wants to improve or maintain their gut microbiome health, what are we communicating to them?
Well, I think the reason you said that it's like the answer is like a non-sexy answer is just because there's still, it was very apparent as she's talking that there's still that we just don't know. Like there were a lot of things that she was just saying there's not good enough research on it, or saying like there's claims on the internet that aren't necessarily exactly true with different things that she's seen and studied. And we also know the way she kind of explained it is, not everybody's, our guts aren't the same between human to human. Like everybody's gut is kind of like unique to them to a degree. So, there are things like we talked about fiber earlier, and there are things that we believe to be good, or I know that it's largely believed that there's types of yogurts out there that have like really good bacteria and stuff like that. So there are some things that we know, but it just appeared that there was so much still unknown that we don't necessarily have like a really clear view on how to like improve everyone's gut health across the board.
But she said, in lieu of specific interventions, manage your stress, exercise, eat a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables.
Basically all recommendations that we would make anyways, not specific to the gut, right? Like manage your stress, stay active, eat a well-rounded quality diet, and that's probably enough. Throwing in a kombucha or a probiotic to a shitty diet, probably not going to help you all that much. So it's not a magic bullet. So those are my major takeaways.
Yeah, and as she said, or maybe it was the podcast host that said this, is that at best, if you do all that, you're going to have better gut health. At worst, if you do all that, you're just going to be a healthier person.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not to necessarily say a lack of research on certain things isn't an indictment on those things. It's just we can't say with certainty that, we probably shouldn't be espousing the massive health benefits of things that we don't know for sure that's actually a true statement. It may be that a prebiotic supplement or fermentable foods are helpful, but we don't really know. So just be careful with the language we use. Anything else?
I would have liked to have heard her take on some of these like gut health tests that exist. When you send in either blood work or actual like fecal matter, you send it into these companies, and then they do an assessment on where you're lacking in terms of specific bacteria.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I don't know that we know enough yet to really be able to like say that for sure. And I think it's so complicated too, because there are so many, like, it's not just about like one type being good or one type being bad. From my understanding, it's the balance and the interaction of all the different strains. But I could be, maybe we do have enough information to make some basic assertions. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I think we have enough information to make some basic assertions for very specific things, like she mentioned, like the traveler's diarrhea or the things of that nature. But for general health, which is I think what Kemper's talking about, that's kind of marketed towards, is general health or some of these issues that we don't really know much about. I think it's just people trying to make a sale and make money off people's desperation to have an answer to their issue. And like Sawyer said, we just don't know enough. Like everybody wants to know and everybody needs to know, and so uncomfortable not knowing that they make up these stories in their head that we do know, and people are selling it with good credentials behind their name that they do know because they need to make money. And it's just another example of our society fucking people over because they want to make a buck. And there's just not, we just don't know enough. Like, this is a PhD in this subject. I've read multiple PhDs in this subject, and there's only a few of them that will actually straight up say we don't really know. And there's a lot of them that say I do know and wanna. It's really frustrating for me because we're the ones that we're the ones that a lot of people really do trust, and then we have to burst their bubble of having a solution for their issue because we're the ones that have to tell them that person is selling them whatever they're selling them or they already bought isn't actually the thing that's going to fix them.
Exactly. There's a danger in over medicalizing these kind of things. I think if you do have a specific gastrointestinal issue, you need to go see a gastroenterologist and have a complete diagnostic workup done. If you have mild, just random issues here or there, it doesn't mean you should run out and get the 23andMe version of the gut microbiome, because then you're going to find something. Whenever you test in medicine, inevitably you find something, and then once you found it, now you've labeled yourself with a diagnosis, and then you have to decide, am I going to do all the many things that are associated with addressing that diagnosis? It's like a food allergy test. Same thing there. You get it, and you find out, well, I'm allergic to this, this, and this. Well, are you now willing to undertake the lifestyle that would allow you to treat all of those things? And if not, don't even get the test in the first place, because then you're just putting yourself in a psychological state that isn't all that positive. So I agree with Jared there, that Sawyer, to a great extent. You said it earlier, Sawyer, we know just enough information here to be dangerous.
Yeah.
And the one thing that we do have the most information on is stress and mental health. And that's something that could very well help you with your GI issues, but it's also going to help you in every other facet of your life. In every facet of your life, and every one of the 7 or 8 dimensions of wellness, like, interact with each other. So if you can reduce that stress and mitigate that stress and improve your physical wellness, you're going to improve all of those other things, and it's all compounds each other. So I would always try to shift somebody towards addressing that aspect of it first, because it's a win-win. And then if the GI symptoms start to diminish, great. If not, then like Mike said, or even simultaneously going and seeing a gastroenterologist to try to get a diagnosis. But it's unfortunate, but there's a lot of people in this realm that are trying to make a fast dollar, and it puts a lot of people in a bad spot.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's what happens when a science is emerging. Once a science is more established, it's difficult to do that. But when a science is emerging, it's easy to sell the snake oil because not everyone understands enough about it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, awesome conversation. I think this was, I learned a number of things from the podcast, and
Good one.
good conversation.
Awesome.
Thanks, Sawyer.
Yep. Thanks everybody.
Yep. Bye.
See you guys.